Julian thought he had stripped me of everything when he called me a temporary placeholder in front of his billionaire mistress. He believed he was clearing the way for a merger that would make him a king. But as he raises his glass, he has forgotten one deadly clause buried deep in the source code I wrote with my own hands. That truth is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and it is about to turn his dream into a living nightmare. My name is Morgan Vale, and I stood in the periphery of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, a ghost haunting my own life. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen explosions, refracting the light into 1,000 jagged rainbows that danced across the faces of New York's elite. In the center of it all was my husband, Julian Thorne. He looked impeccable in his bespoke tuxedo, raising a flute of vintage champagne to a room full of people who hung on his every word. He was celebrating the crowning achievement of Thorne Dynamics, a success built entirely on the foundation of my research. I watched as Julian's smile widened, that charming, practiced expression that used to make my knees weak. He tapped a spoon against his glass, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. With a voice smooth as velvet, he announced the merger with Sterling Industries. The applause was thunderous. It made sense now why the old titans of industry were nodding in approval. Sterling Industries was a massive conglomerate owned by the father of Sienna Sterling, a woman whose name had been whispering through the tabloids lately. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I forced myself to clap, playing the role of the supportive wife one last time. Before I could make my way to him, a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. It was Richard Thorne, my father-in-law and the chairman of the board. He guided me not toward the celebration, but into a private, wood-paneled study just off the main hall. I naively thought he wanted to thank me privately. After all, I had spent 7 years of my life bleeding for the Gen Zeta project, the very technology that made this merger possible. Instead, Richard slid a single manila envelope across the mahogany desk. He did not look me in the eye when he told me I was being let go. He called it restructuring personnel, a corporate euphemism for cutting out the heart of the company to make it look prettier for the new buyers. The timing was surgical. They were removing me from the board exactly 48 hours before the merger was finalized. The door opened behind me, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian walked in, but he was not alone. Sienna Sterling was on his arm, draped in silver silk that clung to her like a second skin. My eyes instantly locked onto her left hand. There, glittering under the recessed lighting, was a blue diamond ring. It was a rare, distinct cut that I had once pointed out to Julian in a magazine, foolishly dreaming it would be mine for our 10th anniversary. Julian did not look guilty. He looked relieved. He stood next to Sienna, their fingers interlaced, presenting a united front against the woman who had built his fortune. He looked at me with a pity that burned worse than hatred. He told me that I was just a placeholder. He said I was a fantastic employee, brilliant even, but I was not the wife of a global CEO. He said Sienna was the future. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its efficiency. He had extracted every ounce of my intellect and was now discarding the shell. The humiliation that followed was swift and bureaucratic. Richard pressed a button, and 2 security guards I had known for 5 years entered the room. They asked for my keycard. They confiscated my company laptop, the machine that held thousands of hours of my coding and research. I was escorted out of the building I helped build from the ground up, marched through the service exit like a criminal. As the heavy steel doors swung open to the street, Sienna leaned in close, her perfume sickly sweet. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my dress with disdain. She told me my style was outdated and that I simply did not fit the aesthetic of the new Thorne Dynamics. I stood alone on the sidewalk as the heavy doors clicked shut behind me. It was a bleak November night in Manhattan, and the sky had opened up, dumping a miserable mix of rain and sleet onto the city. The cold bit through my thin evening gown, soaking me to the bone within seconds. I shivered, not just from the temperature, but from the hollow realization echoing in my chest. In the span of 30 minutes, I had been stripped of my husband, my career, and the technological child I had nurtured for nearly a decade. The city lights blurred through the freezing rain, and I realized I had absolutely nothing left. The divorce proceedings moved with the terrifying speed of a guillotine blade. The legal team for the Thorne family did not see me as a person, but as a loose end to be cauterized. They slid a document across the polished conference table that sealed my fate. It was a modified prenuptial agreement. I stared at my own signature on the page, a jagged scrawl from 2 years ago. I remembered the night I signed it. It was 3 in the morning, and I had been awake for 30 hours straight trying to fix a critical bug in the Gen Zeta kernel. Julian had handed me the pen and a cup of coffee, whispering that it was just a boring formality for tax purposes. I had signed away my future for a caffeine fix and a reassuring kiss. The fallout was instantaneous. My access to our joint accounts was revoked, the digital walls slamming down around the fortune I helped amass. I checked my personal savings and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a pitiful sum, barely enough to cover a month of living expenses in this city, and the crushing weight of my unpaid student loans from MIT was still looming over me. I tried to pivot. I dusted off my resume and reached out to every competitor of Thorne Dynamics. I thought my skills would be my shield, but I was wrong. Richard Thorne had been busy. He had placed me on an informal blacklist that circulated among the pharmaceutical giants. The rumor was subtle but lethal. They whispered that I was unstable, that I had attempted to steal proprietary data upon my exit. Interviews that began with enthusiasm ended with polite, icy rejections. The eviction notice came next. I was forced out of the penthouse on the Upper East Side, the home where I had hosted galas and dinners for senators. I packed my life into a few cardboard boxes and moved to a basement apartment in Queens. The air down there was thick and heavy, smelling of mildew and old cooking oil. The windows were narrow slits at street level, offering a view of passing ankles and tires. To keep the lights on, I had to cannibalize my past. I took my designer handbags, the jewelry Julian had given me as apology gifts for missed anniversaries, and the silk scarves I used to wear to board meetings, and I sold them all. I stood in line at consignment shops and pawnbrokers, watching them haggle over the price of my dignity. I sold everything except one item. I kept a battered, sticker-covered hard drive from my college years. It was obsolete junk to anyone else, but I tucked it into the bottom of my duffel bag like a talisman. I lowered my standards until they were scraping the floor. I applied for junior coding positions, then data entry, then administrative assistant roles. I was rejected from all of them. My resume was too intimidating for the small jobs and too toxic for the big ones. My self-esteem eroded with every generic rejection email. Desperation eventually led me to a job that required no background check and asked no questions. I became a medical courier working the graveyard shift. For minimum wage, I drove a dented white van through the city, transporting coolers filled with blood samples, biopsies, and occasionally, transplant organs. I was hauling the literal lifeblood of others while my own life was bleeding out. The driving was the worst part. It left me alone with my thoughts for 8 hours a night, and the city would not let me forget. Every time I crossed the bridge or drove through Times Square, I saw them. Thorne Dynamics had launched a massive PR campaign. Giant digital billboards illuminated the night sky, featuring Julian and Sienna. They looked like royalty, their 50-foot smiles beaming down at the gridlocked traffic. The caption announced their engagement and the dawn of a new era. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, tears stinging my eyes. I checked my phone during breaks, hoping for a text, a call, anything from the circle of friends I had spent a decade cultivating. But the screen remained dark. The socialites and the wives of other executives had ghosted me. They were terrified of Richard Thorne's influence. Poverty, I realized, was not just the absence of money. It was the sudden, suffocating absence of people. I was completely and utterly alone in a city of 8 million strangers. 3 months of winter had carved the softness out of me. I looked in the rearview mirror of the delivery van and barely recognized the woman staring back. My cheekbones were too sharp, my skin was pale and drawn, and my hands were a map of red, cracked skin from hauling heavy medical crates in freezing temperatures. The gloves provided by the courier company were thin and useless against the biting wind. It was the middle of a blizzard when the dispatch radio crackled with an urgent order. It was a priority delivery to a private residence in the Hamptons. The pay offered was triple the standard rate, so I did not ask questions. I just drove. The drive took 4 hours of white-knuckle navigation through blinding snow. When I finally pulled up to the wrought iron gates, my stomach dropped. I knew this place. It was the Sterling family estate, a sprawling oceanfront mansion that looked more like a fortress. The driveway was lined with luxury cars that cost more than I would earn in 10 lifetimes at this job. Through the tall windows, I could see the warm glow of a party in full swing. It was the pre-wedding celebration for Julian and Sienna. I grabbed the insulated package, which the manifest listed as high-end nutritional supplements, and trudged through the snow to the service entrance. I wanted to drop it and run, to vanish before anyone saw me. But the head butler opened the door and shook his head. He told me the kitchen was overwhelmed and instructed me to take the package directly to the main salon where the gifts were being staged. I tried to protest, but he cut me off with a sharp glare. I was just a delivery driver. I had to follow orders. I walked into the warmth of the salon, my boots squelching on the marble floor, leaving a trail of muddy slush. I was wearing a shapeless navy blue nylon uniform that smelled of exhaust fumes. The chatter in the room died down instantly. It started as a ripple of confusion and ended in a suffocating silence. Julian was standing near the fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler. He turned, and for a second, he looked confused. Then, recognition dawned on him. The color drained from his face, not from shame, but from sheer disbelief. Sienna, standing beside him in white velvet, broke the tension. She threw her head back and laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. She called out to the room, announcing that the poor delivery girl had finally arrived. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and crumpled it up. She tossed it onto the floor at my feet like she was feeding a stray dog. I stood frozen, the heat of 100 stares burning my skin. Julian stepped forward, crossing the distance between his world and mine. He leaned in close, invading my personal space. His breath smelled of expensive scotch. He whispered in my ear, his voice low and venomous. He told me to look around. He said this was my true station in life. He told me I should be grateful that he had tolerated me for as long as he did, because clearly, I never belonged among them. My pride screamed at me to spit in his face, to throw the money back at him. But my bank account was empty, and I needed to eat, slowly, painfully. I bent down. My knees cracked as I reached for the bill on the polished floor. It was the single most humiliating moment of my life, but as I straightened up, clutching the money, my gaze drifted past Julian's shoulder to a large projection screen set up in the corner. It was running a loop of the Gen Zeta software interface, a backdrop for their victory lap. That was when I saw it. In the bottom right corner of the command line, there was a microscopic flicker. A tiny sequence of pixels flashed in a pattern that looked like a glitch to the untrained eye. But it was not a glitch. It was a digital signature. It was a specific error code I had buried deep in the architecture years ago. A sudden clarity washed over me, cold and sharp as the ice outside. I did not cry. The tears that had threatened to spill moments ago evaporated instantly. I shoved the $100 bill into my pocket. I looked at Julian one last time, not with the hurt of a discarded wife, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. I turned on my heel and walked out of the mansion. The shame was gone, replaced by the awakening of a memory I had repressed in the chaos of the divorce. I walked back to my van in the freezing dark, my mind racing. I knew exactly what that code meant, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I burst into my damp basement apartment and did not bother taking off my wet coat. I fell to my knees beside the stack of water-damaged cardboard boxes in the corner, tearing through the packing tape with my fingernails. I needed one specific item. I tossed aside old textbooks and framed diplomas until my hands closed around a worn, black leather notebook. It was my research journal from 10 years ago. I opened it, the pages smelling of dust and old ink. There it was. The initial algorithms for the Gen Zeta core kernel were dated and time-stamped 2 full years before I married Julian and 3 years before Thorn Dynamics even existed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I booted up my sluggish laptop. I navigated to the public patent database, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I searched for the recent filings by Thorn Dynamics. The screen refreshed, and I saw it. They had filed for a renewed license on the technology to clear the way for the merger, but the status was still listed as pending. I dug deeper into the filing history and found the fraudulent claim. Julian had signed an affidavit stating that the source code was work for hire created during my employment. He had built a billion-dollar deal on a lie that I held the paper trail to disprove. I did not call a standard law firm. I needed someone who hated Richard Thorn as much as I did. I took the subway to a crumbling brick building in the Bronx to find Elias Vance. Elias was once a titan of intellectual property law until Richard Thorn buried him in frivolous lawsuits and destroyed his reputation to protect a pharmaceutical patent. I found Elias sitting in a dim office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and defeat. He looked at me with tired, watery eyes and told me to leave. He said he had no interest in fighting the Thorn family again. He told me it was suicide. I did not argue. Instead, I placed my laptop on his cluttered desk and opened a command terminal. I showed him the lines of code I had spotted at the party. I explained that what he was looking at was a digital kill switch. I told him that when I wrote the kernel, I was paranoid about security, so I embedded a dormant protocol. The system required a biometric authentication update from the original creator every 5 years. If it did not receive that handshake, the kernel would assume a security breach and lock itself down permanently, encrypting all data beyond recovery. Elias leaned in, squinting at the screen. I told him to check the date of the last authentication. He did the math and his eyes went wide. The 5-year cycle was set to expire in exactly 48 hours. That was the exact day and time Julian was scheduled to sign the merger contract with Sterling Industries. Elias sat back in his creaking leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He realized that we were not just looking at a lawsuit for unpaid wages or wrongful termination. We were holding a nuclear weapon. If the system locked down during the merger, Thorn Dynamics would be selling a hollow shell. The company would be worthless instantly. He asked me what I wanted to do. He suggested we could file an injunction immediately to stop the merger. I shook my head. An injunction would give them time to prepare, to spin the story, or to try and bribe me. I told him we would do nothing. We would let them proceed. We would let Julian put on his tuxedo and invite the press. We would wait until the pen was hovering over the paper. We were going to let the clock run out and watch the empire crumble in real time. I stared at the crumpled $100 bill Sienna had thrown at my feet. Instead of using it for groceries, I decided to use it as an investment in my resurrection. I combined it with the last scrap of my savings and walked into a high-end rental boutique. I needed armor. I rented a charcoal gray power suit with sharp lapels that screamed authority. I went to a salon school and paid a student to fix the disaster that was my hair, restoring it to the sleek, professional cut I wore when I ran the research department. When I looked in the mirror, the medical courier was gone. The architect had returned. My next move was psychological warfare. I sat in a noisy internet cafe and routed my connection through 3 different servers to send a single anonymous email to the private inbox of Arthur Sterling. I did not make wild accusations. I simply suggested that he instruct his technical due diligence team to run a query on the ownership history of the Gen Zeta kernel before the signing ceremony. It was a small seed of doubt, but in a merger worth billions, doubt is a fatal poison. By the afternoon, the first tremors hit Thorn Dynamics. I monitored the internal chatter through a backdoor link I had never closed. Low-level engineers were reporting access denied errors on the test servers. It started as a trickle, but within an hour, it was a flood. I imagined Julian screaming at the IT director. I knew exactly what they were seeing. They were trying to bypass the encryption, but they were failing. The algorithm was tied to my specific biometric rhythm, a digital heartbeat that no amount of brute force computing could mimic. My phone buzzed with a call from a blocked number. I hesitated before answering. It was Sarah, my former assistant, whispering from a bathroom stall. She told me the executive floor was in a state of absolute panic. She said Julian was tearing his office apart, looking for the original master password file. She told me he looked like a man who was drowning. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a cold, steady satisfaction settling in my chest. Across town, Elias was finalizing our warhead. He printed out a 40-page legal affidavit that detailed the exact timeline of the code creation. It proved undeniably that the intellectual property belonged to me and that the rights were non-transferable without my biometric signature. It was a dense, impenetrable shield of legality that would withstand any corporate lawyer Julian could throw at it. I spent the evening rehearsing the confrontation in the cracked mirror of my tiny apartment. I practiced my posture, my tone, and the exact way I would look at him. I searched inside myself for the heartbreak that had nearly killed me 3 months ago, but it was gone. The love I had for Julian had evaporated, leaving behind only a diamond-hard contempt. I was no longer afraid of him. I was the one holding the leverage. The rumors began to swirl on Wall Street just before dinner. The stock tickers showed a slight wobble in Thorne Dynamics shares. Traders were whispering about a technical glitch in the billion-dollar merger. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks were starting to show. Then, my phone lit up. It was Julian. Then it rang again, and again. He was calling from his personal cell, then his office line. He was desperate. He had realized too late that he needed the person he had thrown away like garbage. I did not decline the calls. I simply set the phone on the table and watched the screen light up and fade into darkness, over and over again. I had blocked every avenue of communication. If he wanted to talk to me, he would have to do it on my terms, in front of the entire world. The morning of the signing arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron. I walked into the lobby of Thorne Dynamics, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The lobby was swarming with press photographers and lower-level executives trying to look important. They were all there to witness the birth of a corporate titan, oblivious to the fact that they were actually attending a funeral. I approached the security turnstiles with my head held high. The head of security, a man named Miller who had forcefully escorted me out by my elbow just months ago, stepped in front of me with his hand raised. He started to tell me I was banned from the premises, but Elias stepped out from behind me. He did not look like the defeated old man from the Bronx anymore. He thrust a court order directly into Miller's chest. It was a mandatory injunction granting me immediate access as the primary disputant in an active intellectual property case involving the assets being sold today. Miller read the legal stamp, turned pale, and stepped aside without a word. We took the elevator to the penthouse boardroom. The doors slid open to reveal a scene of carefully curated power. The long conference table was set with crystal water pitchers and thick legal binders. Julian sat at the head, flanked by Richard and the entire Sterling clan. Arthur Sterling looked impatient, checking his watch. Sienna was there, posing for a photographer in the corner, radiating victory in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my entire student debt. When I walked in, the room went dead silent. It was as if I had sucked the oxygen out of the air. Julian looked up, and the blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His eyes darted to the security guards, then to me. Absolutely terrified. Sienna froze, her smile curdling into a look of confused disgust mixed with a flicker of genuine fear. She knew I was not supposed to be here, and my presence shattered the perfect tableau she had arranged. Richard Thorne stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He shouted for security to remove me immediately, claiming I was trespassing and harassing them on a private business day. But before the guards could move, Arthur Sterling held up a hand. The patriarch of the Sterling Empire was a shark, and sharks sense blood in the water. He looked from Richard's panic to my calm demeanor and told everyone to sit down. He said he wanted to hear what I had to say before anyone signed anything. I walked past Richard without even glancing at him. I pulled out the chair directly opposite Julian. The leather creaked as I sat down, comfortable in the silence. I reached into my bag and pulled out the battered, sticker-covered hard drive I had saved from the pawn shop. I placed it gently on the center of the glass table. It made a heavy, solid thud that echoed in the quiet room. I folded my hands on the table and looked Julian dead in the eye. I spoke clearly, making sure every reporter and shareholder in the back of the room could hear me. I told them that they were trying to sell a car without an engine. I tapped the hard drive with my index finger and added that I was the only person on Earth who held the starter key. Julian laughed, but it was a thin, nervous sound that fooled no one. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, and addressed the room with a shaky smile. He claimed that I was a disgruntled ex-wife suffering from a breakdown. He called my actions a desperate attempt at extortion and apologized to the Sterlings for the interruption. He tried to wave the security guards over again, but I didn't flinch. I simply pointed to the massive presentation screen behind him. I challenged him to run the demo. I told him that if he owned the technology, he should have no problem showing his investors how it worked. Julian hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead, but with Arthur Sterling staring him down, he had no choice. He nodded to the lead technician. The room held its breath as the engineer typed in the execution command. The loading bar filled to 99% and then stopped. Suddenly, the screen flashed black, then illuminated with aggressive, blinking red text that was 30 feet high. It read, "License expired. System lockdown initiated. Please contact creator Morgan Vale." A gasp tore through the room. It was chaos. Phones started lighting up as investors checked the real-time data. On the ticker in the corner of the room, the stock price of Thorne Dynamics twitched and began a steep, jagged descent. Arthur Sterling turned slowly to Julian. His voice was deadly calm. He asked Julian to explain why he had claimed full ownership of the technology in their due diligence meetings. Richard Thorne slammed his fist onto the table, shaking the water glasses. He roared that he would sue me for industrial sabotage, claiming I had planted a virus in their system. Elias stepped forward, calm as a monk in a riot. He opened his briefcase and laid out the documentation. He projected a timeline onto the side monitor. It showed clearly that the core source code was copyrighted in my name 2 years before I ever set foot in Thorne Dynamics. He presented the employment contract, highlighting the clause where intellectual property created prior to employment remained the sole property of the employee unless explicitly transferred. There was no transfer document because one did not exist. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Julian. I told the room the rest of the truth. I explained that buried in my original employment agreement was a licensing deal, a lease for the code that required renewal every 5 years. I told Julian that if he had actually read the contracts instead of spending his evenings in bed with Sienna, he would have known that the license expired today. He had been so busy planning his wedding and his merger that he forgot to secure the one thing that made his company worth anything. Sienna was watching the exchange, her face unreadable. I saw the shift in her eyes. The adoration was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. She looked at Julian not as a fiancé, but as a liability. She was already doing the math on what it would cost to untangle herself from him. I stood up slowly, ensuring I had Julian's complete attention. I reminded him of what he said to me that night in the rain. I told him he was right about one thing. He could replace me as a wife. He could replace me as a face at his parties. But looking at the red warning screen that was currently erasing his net worth, I told him that he could never replace my mind. Richard Thorne ordered the room cleared with a voice that shook the walls. The security team ushered out the confused press and the murmuring shareholders, leaving behind a vacuum of high-stakes tension. When the heavy oak doors clicked shut, only 7 of us remained. Elias and I sat on one side of the table, facing the firing squad of Richard, Julian, and the 2 Sterlings. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Richard did not waste time with apologies or pleasantries. He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. He told me he was prepared to make this go away quietly. He offered me $10 million in a wire transfer, available immediately, in exchange for the decryption keys and my permanent departure from the state. He looked at me as if he were offering a starving dog a steak, expecting me to snatch it up with gratitude. I let out a short, dry laugh. I looked from him to Arthur Sterling and back again. I asked him if he really thought I was that naive. I pointed out that he was trying to secure a merger valued at over $2 billion with a payout of $10 million. I told him that his math was as insulting as his management style. I said that he was still underestimating me, just as he had on the day he fired me without a second thought. Julian stepped in then, wiping a sheen of sweat from his upper lip. He tried to play the emotional card, the one he had used to manipulate me for a decade. He looked at me with pleading eyes, his voice cracking as he asked me to remember our 10 years of marriage. He begged me to think about the life we built and asked me not to destroy his future out of spite. I looked at him with zero empathy. I reminded him of the night in the Hamptons. I repeated his own words back to him. I called myself the poor delivery girl he had mocked in front of his mistress. I told him that the price of the poor delivery girl had gone up significantly since he threw a crumpled bill at her feet in the mud. Arthur Sterling interrupted the domestic squabble. He checked his platinum watch and tapped the face of it ominously. He gave Richard a strict ultimatum. He said they had exactly 30 minutes to resolve the intellectual property dispute. If the software was not operational by the time the hand hit the 12, he was walking away, and the merger was dead. Richard turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. He looked at me with pure hatred and raised the offer. He offered $50 million. It was a fortune. It was enough to disappear to an island and never work again. Elias shifted in his seat, but he did not speak. He knew this was not about the money. I looked Richard in the eye and shook my head slowly. I told them I did not want their hush money. I told them my terms were non-negotiable. I demanded full public recognition as the sole architect of the Gen Zeta system. But that was not all. I demanded a seat on the newly formed board of directors, specifically a seat with absolute veto power over all technical and executive decisions. The color drained from Julian's face completely. He understood immediately what that meant. It meant I would not just be a shareholder. It meant I would be his superior. It meant he would have to answer to me every single day. He looked at his father, panic rising in his chest, realizing that the wife he had called a placeholder was about to become his boss. The tension in the boardroom was already at a breaking point, but I had one final card to play, and it was the one that would burn the house down. While Richard was still purple with rage over my demand for board control, I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a bound document that Elias had compiled from public records and leaked internal memos. I slid it across the glass surface directly toward Arthur Sterling. I told Arthur that before he worried about the intellectual property rights, he should probably look at the balance sheet on page 5. I revealed that Thorne Dynamics was not the thriving empire Julian had painted it to be. It was a hollow shell, rotting from the inside out. I explained that the company was leveraged to the hilt, drowning in short-term debt, and hemorrhaging cash for the last 4 quarters. The merger was not a strategic partnership. It was a desperate rescue mission. Without the influx of sterling capital, Thorne Dynamics would be insolvent within 30 days. Arthur Sterling snatched the document, his eyes scanning the columns of red ink. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. He looked up slowly, his gaze shifting from the paper to Julian. He asked Julian to explain why the liquidity reports he had been given showed a surplus. The realization hit him instantly. Julian had cooked the books. He had lied to his future father-in-law to secure the deal. Julian tried to stammer out an excuse, something about projected earnings and creative accounting, but it was too late. The illusion was shattered, but the most brutal blow did not come from Arthur. It came from Sienna. Sienna, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. The movement was so abrupt that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She looked down at Julian, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. She was not a woman in love. She was an investor who had just realized she bought a bad stock. She reached for her left hand and yanked the massive blue diamond ring off her finger. She did not hand it back to him gently. She threw it. The heavy stone struck Julian hard on the cheekbone before bouncing onto the mahogany table with a hollow clatter. Her voice was colder than the blizzard outside. She told Julian that she needed a billionaire partner to elevate her brand, not a bankrupt fraud who needed her father to save him from the poorhouse. She looked at him with absolute disgust, as if he were something she had stepped in on the street. I watched Julian's face crumble. This was the end of his affair dream. He had convinced himself that Sienna was his soulmate, the glamorous upgrade from his boring, workaholic wife. He had traded my loyalty and my genius for a fantasy of power and status. Now, that fantasy was dissolving in real time. He had sacrificed everything for a woman who only loved his net worth, and now that his net worth was exposed as a lie, she was finished with him. Arthur Sterling did not hesitate. He announced that the merger was effectively canceled. He told Richard and Julian that his legal team would be in contact regarding the attempted investment fraud. He signaled for his daughter to leave. The shock was too much for Richard Thorne. The man who had terrorized his employees for decades suddenly gasped, clutching his chest. He collapsed back into his chair, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray as his heart gave way under the weight of his failing empire. He sat there, wheezing, watching the legacy he had built on ruthlessness turn to dust. Julian ignored his father. He fell to his knees, reaching out for Sienna's hand as she walked past him. He begged her to wait, to let him explain. He sounded pathetic, a broken man grasping at smoke. Sienna did not even break her stride. She stepped over him as if he were a piece of furniture, her designer heels clicking sharply on the floor as she walked out the door without looking back. I stood by the window, watching the scene unfold. I expected to feel a rush of victory, a surge of adrenaline at seeing them destroyed. But as I looked at Julian sobbing on the floor and Richard gasping for air, I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. I just felt a cold, distant pity for these people who had tried to crush me, only to find that they had destroyed themselves. They were not monsters anymore. They were just sad, empty shells. The collapse of the Thorne Empire happened in real time, and it was spectacular. With the merger officially dead and the Gen Zeta system locked behind my biometric firewall, the stock price of Thorne Dynamics went into a freefall that defied gravity. It dropped 30% in 10 minutes, triggering automatic trading halts on the exchange, but the panic was already terminal. The minority shareholders who had been waiting in the wings stormed into the room, ignoring security. They were terrified of losing everything, and they realized instantly that the man crying on the floor could not save them. They turned their desperate eyes to me. I remained seated at the table playing with a pen while the room descended into anarchy. I waited for the noise to subside before I made my final move. I told them that I could stop the bleeding. I told them I could unlock the system, restore the code, and stabilize the stock price within the hour. But the price of my cooperation was no longer negotiable. I did not want a seat on the board, and I did not want a payout. I demanded 51% of the company. I proposed a debt-for-equity swap that would convert the value of my intellectual property into a controlling interest. Richard Thorne looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He tried to protest, wheezing that I was stealing his company. Elias leaned forward and reminded him that the alternative was a federal investigation for securities fraud, and likely a prison sentence for both him and his son. The choice was binary. They could be poor and free, or poor, and incarcerated. With shaking hands, Richard pushed the transfer documents toward Julian. My husband looked at me one last time, searching for a trace of the woman who used to pack his lunch and proofread his emails. He found only a stranger with eyes like steel. He signed the papers, giving away his birthright. The moment the ink was dry, I exercised my first act as the majority shareholder. I looked at the head of security and pointed at Julian. I ordered him to remove the former CEO from the building immediately, as he was no longer authorized to be on the premises. The irony was perfect. 2 guards grabbed Julian by the arms just as they had grabbed me months ago. He kicked and screamed, shouting that he built this place, but nobody listened. They dragged him out of the boardroom, leaving deep scuff marks on the floor he used to own. Sienna was the last of the old guard to leave. She paused at the heavy oak doors and looked back at me. There was no mockery in her eyes anymore, only a sharp, terrifying respect. She realized that she had underestimated the wrong person. She gave me a single curt nod acknowledging the kill and then turned her back, walking away from the wreckage of Julian Thorne forever. I signed the final line of the document, officially appointing myself as the chairwoman and CEO of the newly reorganized corporation. I stood up, smoothing the lapels of my suit, and walked out of the boardroom. The lobby was a zoo. Reporters were shouting over each other, flashing cameras in my face, asking about the scandal, the failed merger, and the fate of my marriage. I walked through the crowd with a security detail parting the sea of microphones. I did not answer a single question about Julian. When a reporter from the Times shoved a recorder near my face and asked how I felt about taking over my ex-husband's legacy, I stopped. I looked directly into the camera lens, addressing the world. I said that true value does not lie in the name you inherit, but in what you can build with your own hands. I added that they learned the hard way that nobody can replace the person who holds the truth. I turned and stepped into the private elevator reserved for the CEO. The doors slid shut, cutting off the noise of the flashing cameras and the shouting press. I was alone in the quiet hum of the rising car. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal doors. I did not see a victim. I did not see a scorned wife. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and came out holding the flame. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your location in the comments below and let's chat. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and give us a hype to help this story reach even more people.